The smell of diesel exhaust and the grinding whine of a heavy engine tore through the morning's peace. A monstrous yellow bulldozer, its blades scarred and gleaming in the early sun, sat idling at the edge of Alara's property, a predator sizing up its prey. And its prey was a half-acre of heirloom roses, each bush planted by her grandmother's hands, their perfume a ghost on the air, a scent that was the very essence of home. Standing between the machine and the garden, her boots sinking into the soft, rich earth, Alara held a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was brittle with age, the typeface faded to a faint brown. But the words on it were grenades, and she was about to pull the pin. Brenda Schilling, the HOA president, stood flanked by two men in cheap suits, a triumphant, venomous smile plastered on her face. "Last chance, dear," Brenda called out, her voice syrupy with faux pity. "Step aside. This eyesore ends today." Alara didn't step aside. She took a step forward, the paper held aloft. "Read it, Brenda," she said, her voice not a shout, but a low, carrying command that cut through the diesel rumble. "Read the covenant from 1905. Read it aloud so everyone can hear how your entire empire is built on a lie. 3 months earlier, the only diesel smell was the distant exhaust of a neighbor's truck heading out for a day's work. The only sound was the gentle hum of bees working the lavender blooms and the soft, rhythmic snip of Alara's shears. Her little slice of North Carolina foothills, a 5-acre parcel willed to her by her grandmother, was her sanctuary. The old farmhouse smelled of lemon polish and sun-warmed pine floors, a smell that meant safety. It was a world away from the sterile, high-pressure environment of the Charlotte corporate law firm where she'd spent 15 years as a senior paralegal, a master of document discovery and regulatory minutiae. She'd traded power suits for worn jeans, boardrooms for berry patches, finding a profound peace in the manual labor her grandmother had loved. That peace was first fractured by a single, crisp envelope stuck in her mailbox. The Crestview Hills, Homeowners Association, official notice. The paper was thick, expensive. The language was bureaucratic, but its intent was brutally clear. Violation, unapproved landscaping, Code 12.4b. The unapproved landscaping was her grandmother's rose garden, a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of color that had bloomed on this land for 70 years. The notice gave her 10 days to remove all non-compliant flora and replace it with approved, maintained turf grass. The fine for non-compliance was $250 per day. A cold knot of disbelief tightened in Alara's stomach. She'd known moving here meant being part of the HOA. The sprawling, newer developments of Crestview Hills had slowly encircled her family's older, grandfathered property over the years, and under pressure from a pushy developer, her grandmother had reluctantly joined a decade ago. But this was an attack on the property's very soul. She tried reason first. She called the number on the letter and was shuffled to a property management company who recited bylaws like automatons. She wrote a polite email to the HOA board, explaining the garden's history, attaching photos of her grandmother tending to it in the 1950s. The response was a terse, automated acknowledgement and a second notice, this one upping the fine to $500 per day. That's when she decided to go to the source. The monthly HOA meeting was held in a sterile community room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. The board sat at a long table on a raised dais, with Brenda Schilling presiding from the center like a queen on a petty throne. Brenda was in her late 50s, meticulously put together in a way that screamed of new money and deep insecurity. Her blonde hair was a helmet of highlights, her diamond studs were a little too large to be real, and her smile never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. She wielded a gavel like it was a scepter, tapping it lightly to call the meeting to order. Her every movement was a performance of authority. Alara waded through interminable discussions of mailbox paint colors and fence height disputes. When her turn came, she approached the microphone, her hands steady despite the anger simmering in her veins. "My name is Alara Vance on Sycamore Lane. I'm here about the notices concerning my rose garden. It's been a historic feature of the property since long before this development existed. I'd like to understand the justification for its removal." Brenda's smile was a tight, condescending line. The justification, Ms. Vance, is the covenant you agreed to when you took possession of the property. Uniformity. Property values. The approved landscaping plan for Crestview Hills is very clear. We can't have one property looking like a wild, unkempt meadow. It brings down the entire community. She said meadow like it was a four-letter word. It's a cultivated garden, not a meadow, Alara countered, her paralegal instincts kicking in, parsing the language. And the covenant's landscaping clause refers to maintained and aesthetically pleasing plantings. It doesn't specify a monoculture of turf grass. In fact, a strict reading could imply that a diverse flowering garden exceeds the minimum requirement for aesthetically pleasing. A flicker of annoyance crossed Brenda's face. She wasn't used to being contradicted, and certainly not with logical, textual analysis. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. The board's interpretation is the one that matters, Brenda said, her voice hardening. And we've interpreted your garden as non-compliant. The fine stands. Remove it. She brought the gavel down with a sharp crack. Next item. As Alara turned away, defeated and seething, she saw it. Taped to the wall behind the dais was a large artist's rendering of the Crestview Hills vision. And there, in the corner where her property currently stood, was a beautifully rendered clubhouse and swimming pool complex. The cold knot in her stomach turned to ice. This wasn't about roses. This was about real estate. Her home, her land, was slated for redevelopment. The garden was just the first excuse, the initial pressure point. They were trying to fine her into foreclosure or harass her into selling cheap. The notices became a daily torment. Monday, fine for unauthorized garden statue, a weathered stone bird bath. Tuesday, fine for parking on unapproved surface, her own gravel driveway. Wednesday, a cease and desist letter arrived from a lawyer threatening legal action for creating a nuisance with the overwhelming and allergenic scent of blossoms. The absurdity was breathtaking. Each envelope, with its crisp legalistic language, was a tiny invasion. The smell of the paper, the feel of the embossed letterhead, it all began to trigger a Pavlovian response of dread. But Alara had spent her career in the trenches of corporate warfare. She knew that bullies relied on volume and fear, not facts. They expected her to be a simple woman, a gardener, to be overwhelmed and to capitulate. They had no idea they were poking a highly skilled legal researcher who had nothing left to lose but the one thing she loved. The anger curdled into a cold, focused resolve. They wanted a fight? Fine. She'd give them a war. But her first battle wouldn't be fought with arguments. It would be fought with history. She spent days in the dusty, cool confines of the county records office, a place that smelled of old paper and lemonwood polish. She ignored the recent neatly filed CCRs for Crestview Hills. She went further back, past the digital records, into the physical deeds and land grants. She was looking for the original, the genesis of it all. Her grandmother had always muttered about the old agreement, a handshake deal with the original landowner that had guaranteed their family's right to the land's use. Alara needed to find it in writing, and then she found it. Tucked into a leather-bound ledger of property transfers from 1905, she found the original covenant. It was a beautiful flowing script on fragile, yellowed paper. It laid out the terms of the land sale to her great-great-grandfather. And there, in paragraph 4, was the knowledge bomb that stopped her heart. It was a clause granting the property owners, in perpetuity, the right to utilize the land for agricultural and horticultural purposes without hindrance or fee. This right being attached to the land itself and not subject to the whims of any future property association or governing body. In perpetuity, without hindrance or fee, attached to the land itself. The words sang off the page. The garden wasn't just old, it was legally, unassailably protected by a covenant that predated the HOA by nearly a century. The HOA's entire authority over her land, at least regarding its use, was built on a foundation of sand. They had no legal standing. Every fine, every threat was not just petty, it was illegal. She made her copies, her hands trembling not, with fear, but with the electric thrill of a hunter who has finally cornered her prey. She didn't send it in another email. She didn't mail a letter. She bided her time. She let the fines stack up. She let Brenda's arrogance grow. She wanted a stage, an audience. She wanted to see the look on Brenda's face when the entire framework of her petty power was shown to be a house of cards. She got her stage sooner than expected. A final notice arrived, not in an envelope, but nailed to her front door. It was an order for immediate remedial action, authorizing the HOA's contracted landscaping crew to rectify the violation at the homeowner's expense. The date was set for Tuesday morning. Tuesday dawned bright and clear. Ilara was ready. She heard the diesel engine long before she saw it. She walked out to her garden, the 1905 Covenant folded neatly in her back pocket, the scent of roses thick and sweet around her. She watched the bulldozer crawl up the road, followed by Brenda's silver SUV. This was it. The first move in a game of chess she now knew how to win. Brenda emerged from her car, the two suits, her lawyers no doubt, flanking her. Her smile was wide and cruel. "Last chance, dear. Step aside. This eyesore ends today." The bulldozer operator revved the engine, a deafening roar of intent. The blade lowered, aiming for the first priceless bush of gardenia roses. The smell of diesel was overwhelming. Ilara didn't step aside. She took a step forward, pulling the ancient document from her pocket. It was time to blow their record monitor apart. "Read it, Brenda," she said, her voice steady as stone. "Read the covenant from 1905. Read it aloud so everyone can hear how your entire empire is built on a lie." The gavel-wielding queen's smile finally faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then the first cold seed of doubt. The bulldozer's engine idled down, the sudden quiet feeling louder than the noise. The battle for Sycamore Lane had officially begun, and the first shot, a single piece of century-old paper, had found its mark. The air crackled, thick with the clashing scents of diesel and roses. Brenda Schilling's face, a mask of smug triumph moments before, underwent a subtle but seismic shift. The condescending smile didn't just fade. It was wiped clean, replaced by a pallid confusion that made her carefully applied makeup look like a cheap mask. Her eyes, those cold chips of flint, darted from Ilara's unwavering gaze to the fragile, yellowed paper held in her steady hand. The two lawyers flanking her, previously statues of impenetrable authority, exchanged a glance. Their body language shifted from aggressive posturing to cautious assessment. The bulldozer's engine, now just a low, grumbling idle, seemed to hold its breath. "What is this nonsense?" Brenda finally managed, her voice lacking its earlier syrupy venom, sounding instead thin and reedy. She made no move to take the document. "It's not nonsense, Brenda. It's the original land covenant from 1905, the one that grants this property, in perpetuity, the right to agricultural and horticultural use without hindrance or fee from any future association." Ilara's voice was calm, clear, and carried the weight of absolute certainty. It was the voice she'd used in countless legal strategy sessions, the voice that could dissect $1 million contract clause by clause. "Your CCRs, the ones you're using to fine me, weren't written until 1998. This document supersedes them. It is attached to the land itself. You have no legal authority to touch this garden. Every fine you've levied is invalid. This," she said, gesturing with the paper toward the idling bulldozer, "is attempted destruction of private property under fraudulent pretenses." One of the lawyers, a younger man with a sharp jawline and anxious eyes, cleared his throat. "May I?" he asked, his tone now markedly professional. Ilara handed him the document. He and his colleague hunched over it, their whispers a frantic hiss in the sudden quiet. Ilara watched their faces, saw the moment their professional bravado crumbled into genuine alarm. They knew. They were looking at a legal IED, and they were standing right on top of it. The second lawyer, older, with a weary cynicism in his eyes, looked up at Brenda. "Ms. Schilling, we need to confer. Privately." Brenda's jaw tightened. The public humiliation was a toxin in her veins. She could feel the eyes of the bulldozer operator, of Alara, of any neighbor who might be watching from behind curtains. Her empire of petty rules and absolute control had just been challenged not with a shout, but with a whisper from the past. "This isn't over," she spat at Alara, the threat landing hollow and weak. "Oh, I know it's not," Alara replied, a small, cold smile touching her lips. "I'll be submitting a formal motion to the board to dismiss all fines and amend the CCRs to reflect the actual recorded hierarchy of covenants. I'd advise your attorneys to read up on restrictive covenant law and the principle of first in time, first in right. It's a fascinating bit of legal precedent." She dropped the terms like stones into a still pond, watching the ripples of discomfort spread across the lawyers' faces. Knowledge bomb number 1 had detonated perfectly. With a furious swirl, Brenda turned and stalked back to her SUV, the lawyers scrambling after her. The bulldozer operator, looking thoroughly confused, shrugged, put his machine in reverse, and rumbled back down the road. The immediate threat was gone. The roses were safe. But as the silence returned, broken only by the resumed buzzing of bees, Alara felt no triumph. Only the cold certainty that she had just declared war, and Brenda Schilling was a commander who would never accept a surrender. She would escalate. The following week was a study in quiet tension. The daily fines stopped. No more letters arrived. It was the eerie calm of the eye of the hurricane. Alara knew better than to enjoy it. She used the time to dig deeper. Her paralegal skills, honed by years of litigation support, made her a forensic architect of Brenda's reign. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the county for all permits related to Crestview Hills development. She pulled every financial disclosure the HOA was required to file. She mapped the board members' names against county property records, and she found the cracks. The vision for the clubhouse on her land wasn't just a dream, it was a deal. She discovered a series of motions, voted on and approved in closed-session board meetings, that allocated HOA reserve funds, money collected from all the homeowners for maintenance and repairs, to pay for architectural designs and environmental impact studies for the proposed recreation complex. They were spending community money to plan the seizure and development of her property. The hypocrisy was staggering. This was the second, much larger knowledge bomb, and she carefully assembled the documentation, a ticking time bomb of her own. She, also, wasn't alone. The silence from the HOA headquarters was broken by the quiet whispers of her neighbors. A note appeared in her mailbox, handwritten on a recipe card. "Thank you. They fined me for my pink porch light for breast cancer. Awareness, stay strong. A friend." Another day, an older man, Mr. Gable from 2 streets over, stopped his car as she was checking her mail. He rolled down the window, the smell of pipe tobacco wafting out. "Heard about your stand with the dozer," he said, his voice gravelly. "Brenda Schilling had my son's basketball hoop taken down. Said it was an attractive nuisance. Boy was 11. Keep fighting, miss. Some of us are rooting for you." These small acts of solidarity were a balm, but they also broadened the stakes. This wasn't just about her roses anymore. It was about every pink porch light, every basketball hoop, every small expression of individuality that Brenda's regime sought to grind into uniform dust. The backlash, when it came, was not through official channels. It was insidious. On Thursday, she woke up to find her internet and phone line dead. A service truck arrived hours later, and the technician, a guy named Dave with a kind face, found the main junction box at the road had been deliberately tampered with. "Looks like someone gave the lines a good yank," he muttered, throwing a suspicious glance toward the pristine houses of the main subdivision. "Almost like it was done on purpose." On Friday, she received a notice from the county health department responding to an anonymous complaint alleging she was running an unlicensed composting operation that was creating a rodent infestation. The inspector who came out, a woman with tired eyes and practical boots, took one look at Alara's tidy compost bin, sniffed the air which held no smell of decay, only flowers and clean earth, and shook her head. "Waste of my time," she said. "This is a beautiful setup. Someone's messing with you." The harassment was a calculated shift in strategy. Brenda was trying to bypass the law she couldn't manipulate and attack Alara's quality of life directly to make her existence so miserable she'd give up and leave. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. A constant low grade. Anxiety began to hum in Alara's veins. Every strange car that slowed down, every unexpected noise in the night put her on edge. The sanctuary of her home had been violated. The smell of roses now carried an undertone of paranoia. Then, the masterpiece of intimidation arrived. A formal letter from a new law firm, one specializing in land use and eminent domain. It cited the HOA's vision for community enhancement and hinted, in dense legal jargon, at the possibility of the association pursuing a right of reverter or even petitioning the county to use eminent domain powers for public use, defining the clubhouse and pool as a public benefit for the community. They were threatening to use the government's power to seize her land. Alara sat at her grandmother's old pine table, the letter shaking in her hand. This was no longer a fight about garden fines. This was a fight for her home itself. The cold resolve that had filled her before now burned white-hot. Brenda wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was a would-be revolutionary, willing to pervert the very concept of public good to feed her own greed for control and legacy. She spent a sleepless night, the weight of it all pressing down on her. She was one person against a board, their lawyers, and now the specter of governmental power. The smell of the night-blooming jasmine outside her window, usually a comfort, felt cloying. The chirping of crickets sounded like 1,000 tiny alarms. As despair threatened to pull her under, she remembered Mr. Gable. "Some of us are rooting for you." She wasn't alone. Brenda's overreach had created victims all over Crestview Hills. If this was a war, she needed an army, or at least witnesses. Her mind, trained to find the weak point in any argument, seized on a new tactic. The HOA's case and their threatened eminent domain action relied on one thing: the appearance of unanimous community benefit. What if she could prove the community was not just not benefiting, but was actively being harmed and exploited? What if she could show the county that this was a corrupt land grab, not a public works project? She pulled out the financial records she'd obtained. The motion to use reserve funds for the clubhouse plans had passed by a 4-1 board vote. Who was the one? She cross-referenced the meeting minutes with the board roster. The lone dissenting vote was a man named Arthur Finch. A quick property record search showed he lived on a cul-de-sac on the other side of the development. A man who had voted against Brenda. The next morning, she stood on Arthur Finch's porch. His house was neat but not ostentatious, his lawn healthy but dotted with native shrubs instead of sterile turf. He answered the door himself, a man in his late 60s with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the weary posture of someone who had fought lost battles. He smelled of coffee and old books. "Mr. Finch, my name is Alara Vance. I live on Sycamore Lane." Recognition, then a flicker of sympathy, crossed his face. "The Rose Garden woman," he said. "I heard. Come in." Sitting in his book-lined study, he confirmed everything. "The clubhouse project is Brenda's vanity piece," he said, his voice laced with disgust. "Her name on a plaque, her legacy. But it's worse than that. The architectural firm that did the plans, it's run by her brother-in-law, the environmental study company, headed by the HOA vice president's college roommate. They're not just spending community money, they're funneling it to themselves. I called it out, I voted no. They froze me out after that. I'm just a figurehead on that board now." It was the vulnerability in the antagonist's armor. Brenda wasn't just corrupt, she was greedy and nepotistic. She'd left a paper trail of her self-dealing. Arthur provided Alara with copies of his own notes, his own failed motions to audit the expenses. He gave her names, dates, and invoice numbers. It was everything she needed. She left Arthur Finch's house with a renewed sense of purpose. She had the ancient covenant. She had the evidence of financial malfeasance. She had a list of grievances from other homeowners. She had a dissenting board member ready to talk. She had the makings of a nuclear option. She drafted a packet. It contained a summary of the 1905 covenant, the financial records highlighting the suspicious payments, a sworn statement from Arthur Finch, and a selection of the petty harassment stories from other residents. She made 10 copies, one for each member of the HOA board, one for the county property manager, one for the state's attorney general's office, and one for the local investigative reporter at the Charlotte Observer, who had a known fondness for stories about government corruption. She planned to send them out Monday morning. It was her final, all-in move. She spent Sunday evening addressing the envelopes, the scratch of her pen, the only sound in the quiet house. She felt a strange peace. She had done everything she could. The battle would soon be public, and Brenda's carefully constructed world of control would be exposed to the light. She sealed the last envelope just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She walked out into the garden, the evening dew cool on her skin, the scent of the roses intensifying in the twilight. She had won the first skirmish, survived the psychological attacks, and assembled her arsenal for the final showdown. She allowed herself one deep breath of satisfaction. The sound of a car door slamming shut broke the silence. Then another, and another. Not the familiar sound of a neighbor's sedan. These were heavier, more official. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees at the end of her driveway, painting the trunks in dizzying pulses. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She walked slowly to the front of the house, her peace shattered, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. 2 county sheriff's cruisers were parked sideways, blocking her driveway. 4 deputies stood there, their hands resting on their utility belts. And standing beside them, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on her face, was Brenda Schilling. She held a single piece of paper which she thrust toward the lead deputy. "That's her, officer," Brenda said, her voice loud and dripping with false concern. "We received an urgent, anonymous tip. We have reason to believe this woman is operating a massive, unlicensed marijuana grow operation on the premises. The smell from those flowers, it's apparently a very clever disguise. For everyone's safety, you need to search the property. Immediately." The pulsing red and blue lights strobed across the dewy petals of the roses, turning the peaceful garden into a scene from a crime drama. The lead deputy, a man with a weary, practiced demeanor named Sheriff Miller, took the paper from Brenda's hand without looking at her, his eyes fixed on Alara. He smelled of coffee and leather. Brenda's accusation hung in the air, so absurd it was almost laughable. A marijuana grow operation? Disguised by the scent of heirloom roses? It was a desperate, vicious lie, designed not to stick, but to inflict maximum humiliation and violation. "Ma'am," Sheriff Miller said, his voice a low, neutral rumble, "I'm sure you understand we have to follow up on this." "I understand you're being used as a tool for harassment, Sheriff," Alara replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline making her fingers tremble. She crossed her arms, not in defiance, but to hide their slight shake. "There is no grow operation. You are welcome to look in my tool shed, or my cellar, which smells of preserves and damp earth. What you will not do is trample through my home or my garden without a warrant based on something more substantial than the spiteful fiction of a woman who has just served a legal defeat on this very spot." She nodded toward the driveway where the bulldozer had stood. Sheriff Miller's eyes flickered with a hint of understanding. He'd undoubtedly dealt with HOA disputes before, though perhaps none this volatile. He glanced at Brenda, whose triumphant smile had tightened into a rictus of impatience. "We received an anonymous tip," she insisted, her voice shrill. It sounded very credible. "For the safety of the community..." "The safety of the community isn't threatened by my grandmother's roses, Ms. Schilling," Alara interrupted, her tone cutting. "But it might be threatened by an HOA president who abuses emergency services to settle personal scores. That's a criminal waste of resources. Isn't that right, Sheriff?" The third knowledge bomb landed softly, but with immense weight. She wasn't arguing the accusation, she was reframing the entire event, shifting the focus of the law from her to Brenda, filing a false police report. Misuse of 911, serious misdemeanors. Sheriff Miller sighed, a long, tired sound. He handed the paper back to Brenda. "Ma'am," he said to her, his tone now carrying a clear edge of reproach. Without any corroborating evidence, a smell, which I don't detect, is not evidence, and given the context of an ongoing civil dispute, we will not be conducting a search. I would advise you to be very certain of your facts before you make allegations of this severity again. He tipped his hat to Alara. Sorry to have troubled you, ma'am. The look on Brenda's face was worth every second of the previous. Anxiety. It was a perfect portrait of furious, impotent humiliation. Her power play had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly in front of an audience of law enforcement. The deputies climbed back into their cruisers, the lights cutting off abruptly, leaving the night suddenly dark and quiet again. Brenda stood alone for a moment in the sudden gloom before turning on her heel and marching to her SUV without another word. The sound of her engine roaring away was a scream of frustration. The attempted raid was Brenda's last, desperate gambit. It had failed, and in its failure, it had given Alara the final piece of ammunition she needed. A demonstrable, recordable, act of malicious harassment. She went back inside, her heart still pounding, but now with a fierce, clean energy. She didn't just mail the packets the next morning. She hand-delivered one to the offices of the Charlotte Observer. The story, featuring the dramatic late night police standoff over a non-existent pot farm, wrote itself. The headline 2 days later was a masterpiece of local journalism. Crestview HOA president used cops in Rose War. Financial irregularities alleged. The fallout was instant and catastrophic for Brenda Schilling. The HOA emergency meeting was not held in the sterile community room. It was moved to the local high school auditorium to accommodate the crowd. The air was thick with the smell of nervous sweat, cheap perfume, and the electric buzz of a mob sensing blood in the water. News cameras lined the back wall. Alara took a seat in the middle of the crowd, not as a supplicant at the microphone, but as a witness to the end of a reign. Brenda sat at the center of the dais, but her throne had crumbled. She looked pale and shrunken, her usual armor of hairspray and confidence visibly cracked. The other board members sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact with the seething crowd. The meeting was called to order, but the gavel tap was a feeble sound. Lost in the restless murmur of the audience, then Arthur Finch stood up. He didn't need a microphone. The room went silent to hear him. I call for a vote of no confidence in the board president Brenda Schilling, he announced, his voice clear and strong. And I move for an immediate independent forensic audit of all HOA financial records for the past 5 years. He held up a copy of the Observer. The evidence of misconduct and self-dealing is overwhelming. We have a responsibility to the homeowners, not to the vanity projects of the president. Chaos erupted. Shouts of, "Second the motion!" and "Where's our money, Brenda?" filled the air. Brenda tried to gavel for order, but the sound was pathetic, a tiny clack lost in the storm. Her allies on the board had abandoned her, seeing which way the wind was blowing. The vote was a formality. She was removed by a unanimous vote of the board, save her own. The audit was approved, but Alara wasn't finished. She stood. The crowd parted for her. She walked to the front and turned to face her neighbors, the people who had been fined for pink porch lights and basketball hoops. This isn't just about one president or one audit, she said, her voice carrying through the silent auditorium. This is about the foundation of the power they wield. My property, my home, was protected by a covenant from 1905, a legal document that their own rules could not supersede. How many of you have received fines or threats for things that might also be protected by older, forgotten laws? How many of you have simply paid up because fighting seemed too hard? She let the question hang in the air. I am proposing a new motion, a motion to form a homeowner committee to review every single bylaw, every fine issued in the last 3 years against the original property deeds and covenants for each lot. If my garden was protected, what else is? The roar of approval was deafening. It was a revolution, not with shouts, but with a simple, powerful legal concept. First in time, first in right. The final and most devastating knowledge bomb. It didn't just remove a corrupt leader, it threatened to dismantle the very engine of petty tyranny itself. In the weeks that followed, Brenda Schilling's world completely unraveled. The audit discovered the full extent of the financial malfeasance. The fees paid to her brother-in-law's firm were grossly inflated. The reserve fund meant for roof repairs and road repaving had been bled dry. She faced not just civil lawsuits from the HOA and individual homeowners, but criminal charges of fraud and embezzlement. The silver SUV was gone. The house on the hill was listed for sale, and the woman who had ruled Crestview Hills with an iron fist became a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered at neighborhood barbecues. Alara's fines were wiped clean. A formal letter of apology was issued by the new HOA board, now led by Arthur Finch. The proposed clubhouse project was officially scrapped. The land it was intended for recognized as irrevocably belonging to Alara, its use protected in perpetuity. 1. Evening, as the first cool breath of autumn whispered through the leaves, Alara stood in her garden. The roses were beginning their final, glorious bloom of the season, their scent richer, deeper, as if in celebration. The smell of the earth was clean and honest. She could hear the distant, happy shout of a child. Young Gable, she presumed, now with a brand new basketball hoop. A car pulled up, not a cruiser or an SUV, but a sensible sedan. Sheriff Miller got out, holding a small potted plant with vibrant purple blooms. He looked slightly embarrassed. "Evening, Ms. Vance," he said, handing her the plant. "Lavender. My wife's idea. Said it might help keep the, pests away." He gave a wry smile. "Anyway, wanted to say I'm glad it worked out. What you did, it took guts and a good bit of brains." "Thank you, Sheriff," Alara said, taking the plant. It smelled fresh and herbal. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who was finally tired of being pushed around." He nodded, looking out over the peaceful, colorful expanse of the garden. "It's a nice thing you have here. A real nice thing. Makes you remember what a home is supposed to be about." He tipped his hat and drove away. Alara set the lavender near her front steps. She looked out at the garden, at the roses that had started it all. They weren't just flowers anymore. They were a testament, a declaration that some things, history, beauty, the right to put down roots and bloom in your own unique way, were worth fighting for. The memory of the bulldozer's diesel smoke was gone, replaced by the simple, profound peace of a woman standing on her own land, unafraid. The Battle of Crestview Hills was over, and the simple woman with a piece of paper had not only saved her garden. She had reseeded the entire community with something that had been long forgotten, the courage to defy and the power to win.